So welcome. This is the third class in a set of 4 classes on Buddhism in a nutshell. And tonight we're going to continue on where we left off last week with talking about Buddha's deepest teaching, which are called the Four Noble Truths. And as we talked about last week, and then after that, what we're going to do is we're going to continue on to the, actually what's known as the Lam Rim or Path to Enlightenment, which is going to take us through all of the steps, step by step from the very beginning steps of Buddhism all the way to full enlightenment. So we will discuss actually the complete path to enlightenment. Okay. So to begin with, though, let's go back and review a little bit of the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths were actually intimately tied up with Buddha's own biography. As we mentioned before, in Buddha's own biography, he talks about a search for an end to suffering. He saw that as the greatest human problem of all, that we have to suffer. And he felt that this suffering was unacceptable and there had to be a way to end human suffering. And in particular, in his biography, it mentions the sort of 3 major obvious sufferings that we have as humans, namely illness, old age, and death. And as we discussed in Buddha's biography, under the Bodhi tree, when he became a fully enlightened being, he found the solution to this problem. And the solution to this problem is described in the teachings that are called the Four Noble Truths. And these Four Noble Truths can be at least described very simply, that we can at least give the title. And so it is the truth of suffering, the truth of a cause of suffering, a truth of that there is a cessation of suffering, and finally the truth of the path that takes you to the cessation of suffering. And so in the first class, we described basically what Buddhists mean by suffering. And the word that's used is this word dukkha, which actually has a broader meaning than suffering. It means being unsatisfactory. It means that no matter what we do in our life, we're never satisfied. We always want more. There's always something that we don't like about our current situation. And what Buddha said really is that this unsatisfactoriness is pervasive in all of our lives. And I talked about the obvious source of suffering, that many of us suffer what's called manifest suffering, which is the suffering of pain, coming from illness, if you have some sort of disease, cancer, or whatever, or even mental suffering and anxiety. That is what's known as obvious suffering. And of course, this is unsatisfactory. All of this, in fact, that's the thing that I think most of us are most fearful of, either that we will have some kind of physical suffering, like an illness, or perhaps financial loss, which will lead to hunger or not having a house, shelter, or just simply mental anguish, mental suffering. But besides that, Buddha said, he said that even states that we would normally think of as pleasure are also a form of suffering if you look at it very closely enough. And I think when you look at these forms of pleasure and talk about them as being a form of suffering, that's when you come closer to this notion of dukkha, meaning unsatisfactory. Because, for example, let's say that there's some wonderful pleasure, some food that you have a delicious dinner, or you make a lot of money, or you get some fabulous new house or new car, some fabulous condition. What we all find is that there is this initial rush of enjoyment, pleasure, But in the end, it's unsatisfactory. Everything new that we get eventually becomes old or worn out, or even if it stays in good condition, we just get bored with it. We get tired of it. We're always seeking novelty. We always want more. You can sort of see this sometimes with these huge billionaires like Jeff Bezos and these people who are even trying to fly into outer space to buy rocket ships and so on, because they just need more excitement. You know, even though they have more money than you could ever spend, and they can buy whatever they want, they still want more. And that's our human condition. We always want more. We're never satisfied. And that's a form of suffering. And as I mentioned, there's also the suffering of change. Nothing stands still. If we have a delicious meal in that one moment when it's brand new, fresh, it's absolutely delicious. But that moment passes, and then we can never recapture it again. Things change. We get bored with it. The meal's over, and we're completely full. We can't keep eating anymore. And it's like that with everything. No matter what we get, there's always uncertainty. There was, for example, the stock market crash in 1929, where people who had fabulous amounts of money suddenly, in the blink of an eye, lost it all and were impoverished. And they were throwing themselves out of windows, committing suicide, because they just couldn't bear the thought of having such a wonderful life and losing it all. And I think that's the problem of life in general, is we can't hang on to anything. Everything always changes, and it can change at any moment, and without our control over how it's going to change. So this is the problem of suffering in general. And what Buddha said is he discovered that, so there is a suffering, but he says when Buddha looked into this more deeply, he discovered that there is a cause of suffering. And I spent quite a bit of time last week discussing that there are sort of two sources of suffering: karma, which is this notion that when we generate positive, virtuous, or non-virtuous actions, which are basically actions that are either harming or beneficial, those actions have karmic results either later in this life or in future lives, and cause either suffering or pleasure. And the other, but deeper cause, is what's known as the delusions or afflictions. This is a translation of a Sanskrit word called klesha. And sometimes it's translated as delusions, and sometimes it's translated as afflictions. And it sort of carries both meanings. The word affliction is because it causes sort of immediate dissatisfaction, being uncomfortable, things not being quite right. And it's called delusions because it's a distorted way of looking at the world. And it's because of those distortions. And one distortion that I talked about in particular is the distortion of exaggeration. We always exaggerate things, and that's not realistic. That's not the way things are. But because we do exaggerate things, it causes us to do actions. For example, in a positive sense, if there's something we want, we exaggerate how wonderful it is and how wonderful it would be to get these sort of things. And because of that, it causes us to engage in negative actions, stealing from things, robbing banks, doing all sorts of unethical things to gain large amounts of money. And it also, on the negative side, it causes us to push away the things that we don't want, which causes us to have hatred toward other people who maybe have criticized us or who we don't like, or and again, a lot of these kinds of hatreds or dislike can cause negative actions, harming someone else, whether with our speech or actually physically, trying to actually kill somebody or whatever. And so all of these negative actions ultimately spring from these delusions or afflictions, these klesha. And what Buddha said, he said that because there is a cause to all of our suffering, it also means that there's also a cessation of suffering. That the cessation of suffering is possible. We just have to stop these causes. And so that's where we are today. And in the medical analogy that I talked about last week, we talked about that, the suffering meaning sort of like in a medical analogy, you have disease. And the cause, there's a cause of the disease. Maybe it's some germ or some condition or whatever. And the cessation of suffering means that that illness can be cured. In our normal world, all illnesses cannot be cured. But Buddha said that this particular illness of suffering can be cured. And in fact, he said, there's a path, there's a way of curing it, of removing these causes. And that's what's going to be the fourth point, fourth noble truth that I'm going to talk about, which is the cessation of suffering. So, or the path to the cessation of suffering. So in this notion of the cessation of suffering, I also talked about this notion of samsara, that beings can be born into different states of existence. And in fact, Buddha talked about 6 different states of existence, from hell realms to hungry ghost realms, things that we ourselves don't directly experience, and the animal realm, which is something that we can experience, the human realms, which is something we can't experience. And the Buddha also said that there's semi-God and God realms also that we can be born into. But the problem with all of these different samsaric states is that they are caused by karma. And whatever state we're in, we burn up that karma that caused us to be in that existence. So if we're born in a hell-like realm, when we're in these terrible states, we burn up the negative karma that caused us to be in that state. And eventually, when that karma is burned up, we will rise up to a higher level. And when we're in a godlike realm, we burn up all of the positive karma that caused us to be born in such a pleasurable state of existence. And so the problem with samsara is that we are constantly cycling through all of these different realms of existence. And the Buddha said that actually we have been in all of different realms in past lives. And in fact, we've talked a little bit about reincarnation, and reincarnation doesn't mean that you yourself, your present personality, migrates to a new realm of existence when you die and are reborn, but it's mainly your karma that moves to the next state of existence. It's the continuation of your consciousness. And again, so basically, the other thing too that Buddha said, which I think is really important, is when he was looking into the causes of suffering, one thing became very clear to him. And what became very clear to him is that everything that is born must die. And the problem with samsara is no matter what realm you're born into in samsara, you must die. And because of that, all of samsara is unsatisfactory. Every form, every type of existence in samsara is considered to be unsatisfactory. Because even if you're in the godlike realms, for example, in that case, you enjoy tremendous pleasures in that godlike realm. But the problem of it is that unlike the Christian heaven, it's not permanent. You can't stay there. Eventually, you will burn up all of the positive karma that brought you into that state of existence, and you will fall back down into some sort of state that will involve overt suffering again. And so that's the real problem. The real problem is there is no permanence anywhere in samsara. Nothing ever stays the same. Everything is constantly changing. So you can't find that perfect, satisfying type of existence where you would just, and if you, even if you could find it, which you can't, you wouldn't be able to stay there, and there's nothing worse actually than imagine being in a godlike realm, having this wonderful existence and then losing it all. It's actually, in my mind, more painful to lose something extremely wonderful than it is to actually never have gotten it in the first place. And it's said that beings in the godlike realms, just before they end their existence in the godlike realms, have some sense of their life coming to an end. And sometimes they even have some sense of what realm they will fall into next. And that causes intense suffering. So that's the problem. The problem is that what Buddha basically saw is that as long as we're in samsara, we'll never escape suffering. And part of the reason for that is that all realms of existence at their deepest level come from the delusion or affliction, the klesha, called ignorance. And that ignorance causes us to engage in all of these negative states of mind. And somehow it, in a deeper sense, is at the root of all of the dissatisfactoriness of all of samsara. So since in a deeper sense, which we'll have to talk about in maybe the last class, this sense of ignorance is because that causes us to remain in samsara. It's our grasping for we actually grasp for existence in samsara, and that's what holds us in samsara at a deeper level. And I mean, if you think about your own life, I think you can sort of see this, that all of us are afraid to die, no matter how good or how bad our current life, except for those few people who commit suicide. Most of us are terribly afraid of death, and we cling to this present life. And most of us feel actually that there's a lot really pleasurable and wonderful about samsaric life, that it's actually wonderful. And so in a certain sense, we don't want samsara to end because we're afraid of losing those pleasures that are in samsara. And a large part of that is because, again, this ignorance. We don't see the true nature of these pleasures, and we don't focus on how they're dissatisfactory, but instead we exaggerate how wonderful they seem to us. And it seems like we can't imagine how you would ever want to live a life without being in samsara. And so we grasp at existence in samsara. And at some deep level, this is what keeps us maintained in samsara. So what Buddha really said, he said that the escape from suffering is really to end samsaric existence. And he said that is possible. And ultimately, the way that is achieved is through wisdom, through overcoming the ignorance that keeps us bound to samsara. And when you overcome, when you achieve this wisdom and are eventually able to escape from samsara, that is often given the word, different words. And again, it's important because the purpose of this whole course is actually to give you the broad scope of all of Buddhism and to see how all of the different pieces fit together. I can't spend too much time on each of the individual pieces, but I want to at least briefly describe each of them. And it's like putting a jigsaw puzzle. I want to give you the larger picture. So in leaving samsara, there are different words that are associated with it. One is called achieving nirvana. And that's actually the Buddha himself, when he was on earth, spoke of nirvana. The other ways that are spoken of it is achieving liberation. And again, this is something that the Buddha himself explicitly talked about as liberation. And another word is called enlightenment, which again, the Buddha also talked about. However, as I mentioned, as Buddhism evolved, I mean, Buddha lived roughly, give or take 100 years, roughly around 500 BC. So Buddhism has been going on for about 2,500 years. And around roughly the time of the birth of Christ, roughly 500 years after Buddha lived, there was the rise of this type of Buddhism that I described in my first talk of this series, the first bin, which is called the rise of the Mahayana. And the Mahayana type of Buddhism is actually the predominant type of Buddhism throughout the world right now. And almost all Buddhism that you will encounter, especially in the West, is mainly Mahayana. Although there is some of the earlier form of Buddhism, which is closer to what actually the Buddha lived and taught. And that's called the Theravadan tradition. Sometimes it's called the Hinayana form of Buddhism. But actually the Dalai Lama prefers to call it foundational Buddhism, because the Mahayana Buddhism isn't a distinct type of Buddhism, but it's really built on top of the foundation of this Hinayana or Theravadan tradition. And actually, in some sense, it's really an extension of it. And in fact, you can't practice Mahayana Buddhism without practicing this foundational form of Buddhism. And actually, the form of Buddhism, which I will begin talking about today, is mainly this lower form, this Hinayana path, but it really is part of the Mahayana path. But anyway, in this Mahayana path, they actually distinguish between liberation and full enlightenment. And essentially, getting in the Mahayana tradition, what they're going to say is that full enlightenment is a higher state than liberation from samsara. And in fact, they try to delay liberation from samsara in order to achieve this, to build up the merit and positive karma needed to achieve this higher state of full enlightenment. And of course, the Buddha himself was a fully enlightened being, and he had achieved this higher state. And as the Theravadins actually recognized, they recognized that Buddha was actually beyond the other beings who achieved liberation at the time of Buddha. The Buddha had greater powers and was a more powerful spiritual being. So anyway, we're going to come to talk about more about this when we talk about bodhicitta and the Mahayana path to Buddhism. But it's just worthwhile to understand that the Mahayana tradition, there is this slight subtlety, that there is some difference to that. Okay, and then the other thing too is that how does this work in practice? So in practice, when people achieve liberation from samsara, and many of Buddha's followers at the time that Buddha was living did achieve liberation from samsara, when they achieve that state, they continue to live the normal life of a human being. But what happens is at the time of death, that is their last death, and they are no longer reborn ever again in samsara. And so at that time, they achieve full escape from samsara, which is called nirvana. And nirvana is this amazingly wonderful existence of pure pleasure and completely satisfactory. In fact, at this point, it's actually useful. Again, I'm giving you this big scope of liberation from samsara, full enlightenment. And I always feel that people in the West who are so goal-oriented tend to get too hung up on this. It's like, we want to become enlightened today or something like that. And to me, that has never actually been, that is ultimately the goal. But I think for most of us, the more important thing is the pleasure that Buddhism gives day to day, moment by moment. Because I talked about how on the negative sense, suffering is broadened into being unsatisfactory. On the positive side of the coin, you can go in the same direction because you can talk about happiness, but as I've said before, samsaric happiness isn't really satisfactory. And there is a higher form of happiness that is satisfactory, and that it is a spiritual type of happiness. And again, part of the problem too with our pursuit of ordinary samsaric happiness is it often leads us into negative states. And one beautiful analogy that the Buddha used for this is he talked about, imagine spreading honey on the edge of a very sharp knife. And then imagine trying to lick the honey off of that very sharp knife edge without cutting your tongue. It's very, very difficult. And Buddha also said that that's the problem with samsaric pleasure. Is samsaric pleasure often leads to negative states. It leads us on toward greed and grasping at things and doing negative things to achieve what we think, what we exaggerate into these, what we think are these wonderful pleasures. And so there is always this knife edge aspect of samsaric pleasure. But on top of that, it is unsatisfactory. No matter what wonderful thing you get, it just doesn't leave you at the end fully satisfied. And like I say, it's never permanent. It always changes into something else. It's sort of like the kid who wants a Christmas present from Santa Claus and is looking forward to it, looking forward to it. And as he's looking forward to it, he exaggerates how wonderful it will be. And it becomes this hugely exciting thing. And then when he actually gets the actual present, most of the time, most kids in a very short time get bored with it and just toss it aside. So that's sort of the way samsaric pleasure operates. But there is this type of spiritual pleasure, or bliss, if you like. It's best achieved in deep states and meditation. And in fact, they do, all of the deep meditators talk about how wonderful this deep bliss is. But you can also achieve it even at a lower level, even in just studying Dharma, studying Buddhism. And for myself personally, this is what has really kept me engaged in Buddhism. I started in Buddhism with an introductory course, much like this BIN class that I'm teaching now. And when I first started hearing about it, I was just amazed, and I enjoyed it so much that I kept coming back. And eventually I finished that class, and then I went on to other classes, and I've been studying it ever since. And actually every single day I study some Buddhism that is not actually attached to any of the other classes that I often take. And I do this because I actually find it satisfactory. It feels wholesome. It just feels good to me. It leaves me feeling sort of almost filled up with goodness, if you like. And I think more than anything, that's what keeps me going in Buddhism. And but in addition to that, through deep meditations, you can get these senses of bliss. And even ordinary people like you can, if you practice meditation diligently, at various times you will touch into some deep states, and you will occasionally get the sense of how blissful meditation can be at its deeper levels. And of course, as you become better meditators, this happens more often. And if you become a great meditator, you can bring yourself into these states at will. And in fact, the Buddha described, there's even higher levels of bliss in meditation, that you can reach many levels of meditation. And interestingly enough, as you go higher and higher, this bliss becomes actually less gross and more subtle. So it's not the tremendous joy that you normally think of, but it actually becomes, in a sense, more blissful, although in a more subtle way, as you go to deeper and deeper levels of meditation. So anyway, and Nirvana goes beyond all of these levels of meditation that you can find in meditating on earth. You can go to, it's just more subtle and just more blissful than anything that can be imagined on earth. So, and these types of spiritual bliss are satisfactory. They don't lead you, people want to meditate more to achieve these states, but at the end of your meditation period, you feel peaceful. You don't feel like you're grasping, like you got to have more and more, the way you do with ordinary samsaric pleasure. So anyway, it's just, these are things, again, Buddhism is all about personal experience, and it's about going out and experiencing these things yourself. So anyway, that's probably enough. And then the only other thing too that's possible to talk about is that full enlightenment, or when you achieve liberation from samsara, in a sense, you've removed all of the negativities of your mind. You have completely eradicated all of these kleshas or delusions at their root. And because you've eliminated all these things, you actually stop creating karma. And once you eliminate all of these kleshas, you eliminate the grasping that keeps you in samsara. And that's why you're liberated from samsara. That's why you're never reborn again. Everything in Buddhism is about cause and effect. And for you to remain in samsara, you have to generate the causes to remain in samsara. which are these kleshas, these delusions or afflictions, which at their root is this ignorance, which is the cause of keeping you in samsara. And when you eliminate this cause to stay in samsara, then you leave samsara. You're liberated from samsara. So anyway, that's probably enough. Yeah, one final thing too is part of the reason that you can achieve this is that what Buddha said is he said that all of these negativities in our state, in our mind, all of these negative delusions or afflictions are, the word they usually use today is they call them adventitious, means accidental. They're not an essential part of our nature. What Buddha said is that even though there is no sense of self, that there is no, if you like, original sin or stain. There's no permanent negativity that's an essential part of our nature. And for that reason, it's possible to remove all of these negativities and achieve a pure state, to get rid of all of these kleshas through spiritual practice. So that makes it, so that's why it's possible to achieve this kind of nirvana. Okay, so that's about achieving that it's possible to actually escape from samsara. And so then the real issue of it is that we have to be practical. How do we do that? And that's the fourth noble truth, where Buddha said, there is a path, there is a way to achieve this liberation from samsara. And what Buddha said is, he says, I know that there is a way because I've done it, I've achieved it. I'm a fully enlightened being, and I did it by following a spiritual path. And if you follow the same spiritual path I followed, there's no choice. You will have to achieve liberation from enlightenment, liberation from samsara, or enlightenment, because our ordinary world of samsara is all cause and effect. And so what Buddha said is, and in fact, almost all of Buddhism is teaching all of these ways to achieve this. And the other thing too that Buddha talked about is Buddha talked about how Buddhism is a gradual path, that you have to change gradually. Because there's another way of thinking about these delusions or afflictions. You can also think about them as negative habits of mind. So we have these things continually, we act out, achieve a lot of negative karma, so forth, and we create habits of mind where we automatically keep generate these over and over again. They become sort of automated. And in fact, sometimes in Buddhism, they talk about being and again, all of these things are inside of our minds. And sometimes the Buddhists talk about how we have no control over our lives. And when they talk about that, what they mean, they don't mean that we don't have free will, but what they talk about is that we've ingrained these habits of mind so deeply that they're automated, and we instantly achieve these things without even thinking about them. And a typical example would be anger. Often somebody can just make some random comment and we just instantly flare off in a terrible anger without even thinking about it. It's completely spontaneous. And the reason why we flare off in those angers is it ultimately comes from this delusion of anger, but it's deeply ingrained as a habit within us. And it's possible to change that. And the best way to change that, as I mentioned before, is actually in meditation. And especially mindfulness meditation is very helpful from actually, first of all, seeing all the delusions that we engage in moment by moment in our lives, and then seeing how they operate, seeing how they're negative, how they actually make us miserable, that they're not good states of mind, that they are very dissatisfactory, and then learning how to apply antidotes. And Buddha teaches many, many antidotes, huge numbers of antidotes of how to overcome various delusions and afflictions. And he just doesn't teach one. For example, for anger, he may have 50 or 100 different ways. And we all need that because all of us have had different karmic paths. We all have different histories, different types of minds. And so things that work for one of us may not work for another. And so we have to sort of find the correct antidotes for us. And fortunately, there's a lot of, I think the Buddha said there's 54, they say there's 54,000 teachings or some number like that. Huge number. Almost all of these things are antidotes. And so that's what a lot of Buddhism teaching is about. And this is wonderful, because as you work on your delusions or afflictions, you remove the negative states of mind that you're engaged in, and you make your life positive, happier, moment by moment, even irrespective of karma or all of these other things. And as I mentioned before, these positive states of mind that we generate in the moment actually influence how karma ripens, because we've generated all of this karma in the past, some of it to generate positive pleasure, some of it to generate overt suffering. But the way that you have to think about, what karma is it that's going to ripen at any given moment in our life? Because we've had countless lives before. We've generated huge amounts of karma. What determines what's going to ripen at this precise moment that I'm living? And the other question of it too is, how is it going to ripen? How is our karmic fruit or results going to ripen? And our present state of mind plays a huge effect in that. And in fact, Buddha said that if karma ripened in a one-to-one way, in other words, we killed somebody in a former life, so somebody in one of our future lives is going to kill us. If that's the way the karma operated, a spiritual life would be impossible. It would never work. But actually, it's because our current spiritual state of mind can modify all of this, that a spiritual life is possible. And the Buddha said, he said, there may be some karmic result that if you have a terrible person, a person that's very non-virtuous, who's a horrendous, who has a lot of non-virtue, who has developed a lot of non-virtuous states of mind, a lot of negative states, a lot of bad habits of mind, if you like. For someone like that, if that karma ripens, it could send them even into a hell realm. Whereas if you have somebody who's living a very positive, virtuous type of life, virtuous meaning beneficial, non-harming, for that person who is practicing who has generated a lot of positive karma in their life, for that person, that negative karma, if it ripens, it may just cause a headache or ripen in some very slight, it will still have to ripen in a negative way because it's a negative type of karma, but it could be almost nothing, almost you may not even notice it. So, and also the other thing that happens is that if you're leading a very positive, where you've developed a lot of good positive habits of mind, which is what we mean by a virtuous life, if you've developed those positive habits of mind and are living that type of life, you will tend to ripen a lot of your positive karma from your past, and your life will tend to be better. So it's very important to, I think, understand this and not to get too hung up on just nirvana. I think the important thing is to actually make your life better moment by moment. Okay, so now, okay. And there is one other thing that I should just mention. I'm not going to have time to go into it, but in the Mahayana form of Buddhism, it is said that there are certain types of spiritual practices that generate huge amounts of karma, mandala offerings, for example. And there are types of spiritual practices which can purify negative karma, which in our tradition would be things like Vajrasattva, mantra recitation, 35 confession Buddha practice, and things like that. So it's just, again, I don't have time to talk about this, but one should be just aware that there are these possibilities are discussed and taught in Mahayana Buddhism. Okay, so now what I'm going to turn to is I'm going to turn to this full path which we call Lam Ram, which is a Tibetan term for stages of the path. So this is going to be, so these are some practices. Actually, many different types of Buddhism have something similar. They sort of lay out a full spiritual path. But in our tradition, which is the Tibetan tradition of Mahayana Buddhism, this sort of first came into play by Atisha, who around 1000 AD came to Tibet and saw the need to help the Tibetans of the time. And he sort of laid out in a very short book how to follow this, what he called the Lamrim path. Later on, the person who started the Gelug tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, which is the largest of the 4 types of Tibetan Buddhism, and in fact, which the Dalai Lama himself nominally belongs to, and which is the tradition of our center, Thupten Norbu Ling Center. In this tradition, Tsongkhapa, who started the Gelugpa tradition around roughly 1400 AD, he saw this path that was developed by Atisha. He became very enthusiastic because it's very practical. It tells you the specific spiritual practices that you need to progress in the spiritual path. There's huge amounts of Buddhist philosophy in Buddhism. Buddhism has been around for 2,500 years. And in great monasteries in India and so forth, there were huge amounts of very esoteric Buddhist philosophy that was developed. But the Lam Rim isn't like that. The Lam Rim is practical. It's the practices that you need to do day to day and how you need, and all of the things that will help you in a very specific way advance along the spiritual path. And so it is sort of the main teaching of our center in the Gelugpa tradition. And Tsongkhapa thought that this was so important that he actually wrote about it many different times and places. And in fact, there are at least 3 different main texts that he wrote on Lam Rim. One is a very short one, which is what we're going to follow. I think it's roughly around 20 verses, which gives, in a nutshell, the whole Lam Rim path. And that's the one that we're going to follow in the rest of this in the next class. He wrote a middle-length Lam Rim, which is far more extensive. And that's what we actually, the Wednesday classes that Geshe Sherab is teaching on, but that's far more elaborate, and that's a thick book. And I think we've been going on that for 2 years almost now. And we're nearing the end of it, the very deepest parts of it. So we're almost at the end of it. But again, Buddha wrote that because he wanted something that had more information, it was more accessible. The one he actually wrote earlier was the biggest one of all, called the Lam Rim Chenmo, the Great Lam Rim. And that's published in a translation, a very good translation that was done by a group of scholars in 3 volumes. So it's much more extensive. And in addition to that, there was a very wonderful Tibetan Geshe, Geshe sort of means PhD in the Gelugpa tradition. It usually takes about 20, 25 years to get a Geshe degree, and only a very few people can do it. But anyway, Geshe Sopa, who came from Tibet originally, eventually became a professor at the University of Wisconsin, a full professor, and graduated many PhDs in Buddhism. Was one of the most renowned scholars in Buddhism. He was actually a debate scholar for the Dalai Lama when the Dalai Lama was trying to get his Geshe degree, which he achieved. The Dalai Lama is actually a Geshe also. But anyway, he wrote a wonderful commentary, which is my favorite books in Buddhism. And he spent 5 volumes laying out this full path. So as you can see, we're going to finish this full Lam Rim path in probably less than 3 hours. But to get the full story, you need 5 volumes. But anyway, this Lam Rim is actually absolutely wonderful because it's so practical and it gives the full background. I'm giving a very schematic background. If you want the full background with all of the details, reading these Lam Rim texts would be great, especially Geshe Sopa's, because he's so clear, so wonderfully clear, and he gives lots of examples, and he teaches in just an amazing way. Unfortunately, he died just a few years ago, but his books live on. Okay, so let's go into this thing. The text that we're focusing on is called The Foundation of All Good Qualities. In previous versions of this course, I used to actually read all these verses, but they've reduced the total length of time I have to teach this from 10 hours to 6 hours, so I have to go faster. So I'm not going to read the actual verses, but I'm going to give you what's contained in them. I'm going to give you the meaning of them. Okay, so the beginning of it is he talks about three principal aspects of the path to enlightenment. So you can organize this total path around sort of three different ideas. And these three different ideas are basically renunciation, bodhicitta, and the wisdom of emptiness. And of course, I'm going to explain each one more carefully. And associated with these various types of, not one-to-one, but the other thing that's talked about in this labyrinth path is we talk about three different types of person. And these actually aren't three different types of person, but you should think about it as sort of three different, if you like, spiritual stages along the path. And the main difference between these different stages is the goal of the individual at each stage along this path to enlightenment. And the beginning stage is, they sometimes call these things scopes, or because it's sort of the area that you're focusing on. The small scope, or the person that belongs to the small scope, really focuses directly on this more notion of overt suffering. And so they actually realize that they understand about rebirth. And so their whole goal is higher rebirth, to be reborn into higher states of existence that are more pleasurable states of existence. Now you can ask, well, why isn't the beginning stage just wanting to get rid of your suffering of this life? And the reason for that is what they talk about. I think Geshe Soka talks about this more, is, and many Buddhists do, is that lower stage, which actually is not bad. I mean, we all want to reduce our suffering. And the Buddha's goal was to get rid of suffering. So in a certain sense, it's not bad. But the problem with it is that it's not really necessarily a spiritual path, because what most people mean by that is they want more samsaric pleasure and less samsaric suffering. And that is not a spiritual path. That is something that, for example, an animal would desire. Even animals want more pleasures and less suffering, less overt suffering. So that's not considered a spiritual path. But when you start realizing that there is karma, there is rebirth, then it leads you to this notion of starting to lead a spiritual life. And through leading a spiritual life, you can create a better existence that leads you to higher rebirth. So that's called the small scope. And associated with that small scope are sort of the beginning foundations of the teachings, sort of the beginning things that you need to learn first as you're following the spiritual path. Now I'm going to talk about lower and higher types of learning or teachings of Buddhism, but in practice, that's not how it's done. In practice, people actually practice a variety of spiritual practices that are a mix of lower and higher levels of spiritual practice. And so you should not think that you have to start off in this lam rim and only do the spiritual practices of the smallest path. For example, bodhicitta is a very advanced state, but people try to practice bodhicitta, even beginners, and that's a good thing. And the other thing too is that all of these different aspects of the teaching of Buddhism reinforce each other. So higher level teachings help you reinforce and practice the lower level teachings better. And the lower level teachings, of course, are the foundation for actually achieving realizations on the higher level of teaching. So you actually need all of these different teachings. And that was something that actually Tsongkhapa very much talked about, especially at the beginning of his Lamrim Chenmo. He talked about that, it's not as though you start at the beginning and you achieve these lower level spiritual states or realizations, and then you throw them away so that you can practice higher level spiritual realizations. He emphasized very strongly that you have to keep all of them going simultaneously. And in fact, he even talked about that as you're following the spiritual path, as you are moving to higher levels along the spiritual path, there are times when you might notice that some of your lower level practices are sort of losing a little bit of steam, that they're getting a little bit rusty. You're not really practicing them very well. And sometimes you want to go back and for a short period of time, put a strong emphasis on sharpening up these lower level practices and sort of bringing them up to a high level again, because they're absolutely essential for all higher level realizations. Okay, so that's the small scope. So then the next, what's called the intermediate scope, or the intermediate being, is a person who then raises, if you like, their spiritual sights on a higher goal. And that higher goal is actually this goal of liberation from samsara. So that's the next higher goal. And both of these, all of these lower level goals are involved with what I'm going to talk about as renunciation, which I'm going to explain. And then finally, the highest goal of all, which only exists, as I said before, in the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, is called full enlightenment. And that's the great scope. And in that great scope, the focus is on developing bodhicitta. And then once you have this bodhicitta, you go on to develop a higher level of training called emptiness, which is, emptiness is a technical term. And it means this wisdom. Sometimes it's also talked about selflessness. But in the Mahayana tradition, they sometimes talk about selflessness, but the more general topic that they talk about, at least in the Tibetan tradition, is this notion of emptiness, which means seeing reality as it really is, developing this wisdom that cuts through this ignorance that keeps you bound to samsara. So you actually need this emptiness or this wisdom actually to achieve the lower level of liberation from samsara. But in the way we organize the teachings, we actually have it follow bodhicitta. And that's the way we're going to talk about it in this bin class as well. I'm going to go through the renunciation phase, sort of the main spiritual qualities that you need to achieve, the realizations that you need to achieve the lower level teachings through renunciation. And then eventually I'm going to try to spend actually a fair amount of time in bodhicitta, because that's much harder for ordinary people to sort of get a feeling for. And then emptiness is a very difficult topic. It's considered, even Tsongkhapa found it very difficult to achieve a full understanding, a realization of emptiness. And huge amounts of courses and books are taught about that. And of course, I can only give you a few minutes of that. But again, you can still get a vague idea of what it's all about and where it's sort of heading. And of course, with the little time I have, that's what I'm going to aim at when I talk about it on the final class next week. Okay, so let's start with renunciation. So what is renunciation about? So renunciation, sometimes they give it another term called definite emergence, which I think it's only in Tibetan Buddhism that they talk about definite emergence. I'm not sure of other forms of Buddhism, but in Tibetan Buddhism, they sometimes use this form of definite emergence. And what they mean by that is emerge from what? Emerge from samsara. And if you actually achieve this realization, it's going to drive you toward that goal of liberation from samsara, which is the goal of renunciation. And so renunciation, from just the way it's translated, you can ask yourself, well, what are you renouncing? What are you trying to free yourself from? And the answer, of course, is you're renouncing samsara. So you're seeing that basically it's this realization that samsara is never satisfying. You're never going to be happy as a samsaric being. You will never achieve perfect, permanent happiness. You will never achieve a heaven on earth. As long as you're in samsara, you always have this possibility of bad karma popping up, throwing you into suffering. Life is always uncertainty. You never have any uncertainty. Life is always going to change. You can never achieve any permanent happiness. And so again, once you realize that, and that leads you, you become sort of what's sometimes called a renunciate. Sometimes renunciate was used as a synonym for a monk, meaning a person who has devoted their whole life toward the spiritual path. But certainly you don't have to do that. Certainly I'm a lay person, I'm not a monk. And it's possible to follow the Buddhist path as a lay person. And many people, even in Buddha's time, achieved extremely high states of Buddhist realizations as a lay person. So one should not get hung up about that. But anyway, so in a certain sense, practicing renunciation, you can think about as synonymous as just seeing that you need to practice a spiritual life. And so now we have to describe that spiritual path. So what is that spiritual life? In the beginning of these verses by Tsongkhapa, he talks first of all about gurus. Gurus in the Mahayana tradition and the Tibetan tradition are a big thing. And sometimes we even talk about root gurus. So guru in Sanskrit means teacher. The translation of that in Tibetan is lama. So lama basically just means teacher. And so so basically in Buddhism, it's realized that it's very difficult to follow the spiritual path without having some sort of physical teacher, someone who can actually talk to you and sort of lead you through this. In today's world, of course, we have whole bookshelves on Buddhism. And in principle, you could, just by reading all of these books, figure out for yourself how to practice the full spiritual path and practice it. But it's somewhat rare for people to be able to do that. For most people rely on teachings from a center like ours, or now, of course, we're all on Zoom and online, but before that, we actually had physical centers. Although actually the Zoom thing is very good because there's many people who listen in on these teachings who, are not in places where there are Buddhist centers. In Santa Fe, we're very blessed because there's Buddhist centers all over the place in the Santa Fe. It's a very spiritual place, but in many parts of the world, there are no Buddhist centers you can go to. So actually the Zoom thing is quite wonderful. You can get sort of a real person, or at least on Zoom, you can actually interact with them and ask questions. So it's actually a wonderful thing to have this Zoom for getting teachings. But there is a deeper thing, and when Buddhism spread to the West, this notion of guru became this really big thing. And it actually is a big thing in many forms of Buddhism. However, most of this big thing, I think, comes from a monastic setting. The people who really talk about gurus and stuff are monastics. And in monastics, it's very easy to get really deep spiritual teachers at your monastery. If you were studying to be a monk at these great monasteries, they have these amazingly, extraordinarily deep spiritual persons. At our center, we're lucky to have, for example, Geshe Sherpa. And so there are monastics who are wonderfully deep spiritual people who are spreading around the world and can give live teachings in the West. But most of this guru tradition actually happened in the East. And it was when you could actually physically attach yourself to a real guru, and almost daily, you could interact with this guru. And if you had any difficulties on your spiritual path, you could go talk to him and have easy access to him. And it was actually a wonderful model. But in the West, of course, that's more rare. The few monks that we do have to serve many people. We don't have, in a monastery, you've got tons of monks who can be gurus for the younger monks. But now it's more difficult and it's impractical. to be able to go to a guru on a daily basis and ask for help for things. And quite frankly, at the beginning stages of Buddhism, you don't need that. All you need are these sort of teachings that we give in the beginning stages, and that's enough to sort of lead you along the path. For people who especially are trying to develop deep meditational practices, or as we will talk about in the fourth class, Tantric or Vajrayana Buddhism, which is extremely deep, very powerful. For those sorts of people, it's very helpful to have a physical guru who you can go talk to, because you often encounter deep and subtle problems, and it's easy to sort of go off the tracks and get sucked into the wrong path, because these things are so complicated and so deep and so subtle, so forth. But I would say that for most of us, we're, just having teachings like we have at our center is fine for most of us, for most of the path that we follow. There is this notion of a root guru, a guru who has an especially profound influence on your life. Some people, for example, would consider the Dalai Lama to be their guru. In our tradition, the FPMT centers are organized by Lama Zopa. Many people think of Lama Zopa to be their root guru. And for some people, one of their local teachers could be their root guru, for example, someone like Geshe Sherab or someone like that. So this is a notion that people find helpful. However, you should realize that you can have more than one root guru. Usually they advise people that if you do develop a root guru, you should, in the beginning, stick to one, because otherwise you'll get confused getting advice from two different people. But when you become more advanced, then it becomes easier to have more than one root guru. And some of the great historic monks that are very famous, for example, talk about, well, I had this root guru who taught me bodhicitta, this other one gave me Vajrayana or tantric teachings. And so in that way, sometimes you can have different root gurus at different stages of your life, or at different times, or for different purposes. So anyway, this is a huge, complicated thing that I can't get into. The only thing that's worth pointing out, I think, is that it is suggested that in choosing any kind of spiritual teacher, that you should be very careful. I mean, of course, in the West, we know that there are a lot of false teachers who are just out there for the money or for the fame or whatever, and will actually lead you on the wrong path. So it says basically some of the guidelines for choosing a good spiritual teacher is you want a spiritual teacher who's a moral person. You want someone who's compassionate, who cares about his students and other people. And of course, you want someone who is extremely experienced in the spiritual path, that is, knows a huge amount about Dharma, about Buddhist teachings. So that's all the time I have for this. There are from time to time various courses and things where they give a lot more details, but I will have to stop at this point. So the second verse is a verse that talks about our precious human rebirth. And this is a notion, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I have to cover so much so quickly, but there is this notion that a human rebirth is actually a high rebirth. It's hard to achieve. You need to be a good person or to have had some very good qualities to achieve a human rebirth. And a human rebirth is considered, of all of these 6 realms, you might think that the God realm is the best realm. That you might say, well, that's where I want to be. I want all this pleasure and stuff. But actually, from a Buddhist perspective, that's not the way it works. The Buddha said himself that the human realm is best. And why is it best? The reason why it's best is because on the lowest realms, there's so much suffering or ignorance that you can't achieve any spiritual progress. When you're intensely suffering, that suffering just overwhelms you. Or if you're like an animal, you may not have the intelligence or the resources to practice a spiritual path. So you certainly don't want to be in an animal realm. And if you go the opposite direction to the higher realm, so the 3 lower realms, So sort of what's considered to be the three, if you like, negative states of existence are the hell realms, the hungry ghost, which is driven by a lot of greed, grasping, and the animal realms. The three higher realms are the human, semi-god, and God. For our purposes, we won't talk about semi-gods. Let's just think about the God realms. The God realms require a huge amount of positive merit or good karma to achieve those states. They lead to huge amounts of positive pleasure. But the problem of it is, as you can check with your own life, again, Buddhism is all about experiencing and checking with your own life. When things are going great, most of us don't want to practice spirituality. We just want to enjoy feeling good. And that's just the natural way it is. So when things are going great, most people don't think about spirituality. And usually when you find people that are trying to lead a spiritual life, they're usually driven to a spiritual life by pain and suffering. Things are going wrong, things aren't going good in their lives. They want to find an escape from that, and they seek spirituality as an escape, as a way of getting a better life, to escape from all the negative things in their lives. And so we can see that if you're in the godlike realms, the problem of it is the most likely thing that's going to happen. It doesn't have to happen. There are people in the godlike realms who do spiritual practice. But for most people in the godlike realms, they just enjoy life, burn up their positive karma, and fall back down to a lower state of existence. And so, like I say, in samsara, if you want good results in samsara, you have to be like this sort of chipmunk running around one of these revolving cages. You have to keep generating more and more positive karma. So even as you do have pleasurable states and you burn up your positive karma, you have to keep replacing that all the time. And you have to keep avoiding generating negative karma so that you can stay in higher states of existence. And within these higher states of existence, that you have good results. Because even in the human realm, which is a good state of existence, there is a wide range of activities, a wide range of experiences, as I've talked about before. There are some people who are practically living a heaven on earth. Everything goes right for them. It's easy to generate wealth. They have big houses. They lead good lives, have good families, have good relationships. Just everything goes right for them. And there are people who are born into intense poverty and suffering, who generate horrible diseases, even as young children and so forth, who have horrendous, that is almost like a living hell on earth, so to speak. Sometimes we call these resembling hells because they resemble the actual real hell-like realms of existence. So even within each realm, and in the same way in the God realms, there's a huge range in the God realms, from extraordinary bliss and long, enormously long lives of bliss to much shorter lives of less bliss in the godlike realms. So there is these variations in all of these different realms. And so you can talk about, so when we talk about this precious human rebirth, the real focus of it is first realizing the reason why it's so valuable is it gives you just enough suffering to generate a desire to live a spiritual life, to motivate you. And you have enough intelligence to understand how to live a spiritual life. And at the same time, you're not overwhelmed by pain. So for a human life, you're motivated enough to do it. And so that's what gives you the best shot at leading a spiritual life. So it's this sort of intermediate state where it's above, certainly a positive state of existence, but it gives you this potentiality of practicing spirituality in the best way possible. So in Buddhism, they talk about a precious human rebirth as something wonderful. And what they say is they use it as a motivating factor. They say, these kind of states are really hard to get, especially to reach a state where you have access to spiritual teachings. So don't waste it. Do as much spiritual progress as you can while you have the chance before you die. So that's sort of the way that it's used in Tibetan Buddhism. So then after that, the third and fourth verses of this text by Tsongkhapa talk about death and impermanence. And this notion of death is, again, Buddhism, it always seems like we're talking about these negative things, suffering, death, all these things. As I said, when Buddhism first came to the West, some people used to call it the dismal science. They said, no, it's so depressing talking about all of the suffering and so forth. But again, as I explained, the emphasis on suffering is because that is the thing we care about most. It's what drives us. Although we would like pleasurable states of existence, what's more important is not to suffer. So in the same way, death for most humans is a very frightening thing, almost universally. It's very rare that you will find an ordinary human who is not afraid of death. And if it does happen that you find such a human, it will be because in previous lives they have done spiritual practice. And that's why they've reached this exalted state. So, but for most of us, death is a terrible thing. It's very frightening. But from a spiritual point of view, what Buddha himself said, Buddha said, this meditation on death is so helpful. And the reason why it's helpful is because we get so seduced by all of these samsaric pleasures. We're constantly chasing after samsaric pleasures. And we're always thinking, oh, if I can just get this one other thing, life will be perfect and life will be wonderful. I'll have a heaven on earth. And of course, it's not possible. From our deeper understanding of samsara, we know that this kind of state is impossible. We're chasing after dreams, windmills, craziness. It's just not possible to reach this. We might be able to achieve slightly more pleasurable states, but they're just never going to be satisfying. So what Buddha said is, he said, the one thing that's certain is everything that's born must die. And by focusing on the fact that we are eventually going to have to death, we're eventually going to have to die, it leads us to this realization that almost anything we do on earth is futile. No matter what kind of empire you build up, no matter how many billions of dollars you accumulate of money and financial resources, at the end of it all, you're going to have to give it up and die. And when you die, you're going to be sort of randomly thrown. Well, not completely randomly, but we could talk, there are discussions on how you work on that. But anyway, there is a lot of uncertainty when you die as to how you will be reborn next. And there's no guarantee that you will be reborn into such a wonderful state again in your next rebirth. So in a certain sense, what Buddha said is that death focuses the mind on the spiritual path. When you realize that everything in life is uncertain, and at your death, things are going to change again, and even in this life, some bad karma can arise. You can lose all your money. You can get struck by a terrible illness. You can get hit by a car and die in the next moment. If you meditate on death, it helps you realize why you need to spiritually practice. Because at the moment of death, spiritual practice is the only thing that will help you, that will guide you into a good next rebirth. And the other thing too, and this brings up these notions of karma, and so I will talk about it briefly here. Again, you can talk about karma for entire courses, for many months at a time. But when you talk about karma, they generally talk about three important aspects of karma. One is what's called the throwing aspect of karma. At the moment when you die, you have throwing karma, which throws you into your next state of existence. And what is said here, again, don't have time to go into it. What's important is that at your moment of death, you want a very calm, peaceful, positive state of mind, because that gives you the best chance for throwing yourself into a higher realm of existence. That is the type of mind which will tend to ripen some positive karma and tend to ripen the right type of throwing karma, which is what you want. Okay, so that's one aspect. Another type of aspect of karma is that karma always gives effects similar to the cause. So if you do something like killing a person, the karma the types of karma that tends to generate, again, as I said, how karma ripens can vary a lot depending on who you are and your spiritual qualities. But the type of karma that will come from killing someone will have something to do usually with shortening some future lifetime. I mean, you could be killed by somebody else, or it could be just, you might get some disease that'll shorten your lifetime. Or it will, because killing is a state of causing physical harm, it could involve some kind of, if it comes in a very light form, it could come in something more like a headache or some kind of physical suffering of some type. So anyway, karma always tends to be similar to the cause. So if you generate negative karma, which is karma that harms other living beings, you will in a future life experience harm in some way. If you generate positive karma, some sort of beneficial, helping people in some way, in the future, that will give rise to some help. So for example, for certain people, just out of the blue, they're struggling and somebody comes and helps them. That's not accidental. That's because you generated the karma for that to happen in some previous lifetime. So that's another aspect of karma. And there's also another very important aspect, which is tendencies. Karma also tends to reinforce habits of mind. So again, it's when you generate these delusions that cause you to generate some type of karma, you're creating habits of mind. So one karmic aspect is when you do these actions, you tend to create a tendency to repeat that action, whether for positive or for negative. So if you train yourself in positive beneficial actions, generating positive beneficial karma, you will have a tendency to do that. In your spiritual life, it will become easier to practice a positive spiritual life because you're generating positive habits that reinforce those types of behavior. So again, that is this notion to, again, tend to do the same sorts of things is considered to be an aspect of karma. And then the final thing is what they call environmental effects. And that speaks to the fact that in whatever realm we're born into, there's an environment around us. So for example, you can be born into a wealthy environment where you have access to all sorts of resources, or you could be born into some either a slum area or maybe very poor desert-like behavior where there's very little accesses, where there's a lot of suffering. That sort of environment that you're born into is, again, a karmic result. So for example, if you are killing somebody, the environmental effect of that type of karma could be living in some sort of harsh environmental area of the world where it's easy to die, some sort of desert or wilderness where there's lots of wild animals or some dangerous area where there's lots of war going on or something like that. So that's considered to be an environmental part of karma. Okay. Just talking again, one thing I forgot to say about this death meditation, the Buddha likened this an analogy to an elephant's footprint. He said that meditating on death really hits us very deeply, and it's a strongly motivating factor. It's sort of like in the same way that an elephant's footstep presses deep into the ground and causes a deep impression. This meditation on death causes a deep spiritual effect on us as a very powerful motivating factor. Okay, so now let me skip ahead. I will talk a little bit about ethics, because ethics, moral behavior, is considered to be, of course, a very important part of the Buddhist path. Because again, as I talked about I think in the first class, ethics is important in two ways. One, there are these karmic results. So if you are a positive person, beneficial, creating positive karma, it will generate more pleasurable states of future existence. But more important is it helps you, it leads to spiritual realizations, because everything in Buddhism is cause and effect. And if you're going to advance further along the spiritual path, you need to generate good karma to help you accelerate that progress. And so it's very important to practice ethics for that reason. And I don't have a lot of time to talk about this ethics. It's actually said that in terms of achieving liberation from samsara, and in fact, the Buddha himself talked about it, there's what they call the 3 higher trainings. And the 3 higher trainings are basically ethics, meditation, and wisdom, or emptiness, this practice of emptiness. So the first thing that you need is you need this ethics, because the other reason why this ethical training works is because it calms the mind. If you're engaged in all sorts of horrible, harmful, harming types of activities, it disturbs your mind. It generates all of these painful states of mind, actually. And when you have these sort of disturbing, painful states of mind, you can't sit and calmly meditate, because they interfere with the calmness that you need to do good meditation. So you actually need good ethics as a groundwork, if you like, for meditation. And it's really, in meditation is the most powerful way to achieve spiritual realizations, because it can sort of help you get underneath all of these underlying exaggerated states of mind, these delusions or afflictions, these kleshas, and to penetrate them and actually see how they're harming your life, and they can actually help you turn around your life. And they also, as I say, they develop these deeply satisfying states of mind. And in fact, the Buddha said that these higher levels of meditation are actually as close as we can get to nirvana while still being in samsara. They're not as good as nirvana, but they can actually be an extraordinarily pleasant way to live, actually generating these deep meditative states. Lama Yeshe is one of the people who started the FPMT, used to say that if only people knew about these deep meditation states and how much bliss they can generate, everybody would go nuts over spirituality, basically. So, and then the final thing is you need to meditate on emptiness. You need to have this wisdom that cuts through the ignorance. And this ignorance is involved with understanding that there is no permanent self. This notion of selflessness is another way that is sometimes described. And again, I will talk more about this on next week's course. But anyway, it's really this wisdom, this emptiness that cuts through the ignorance that causes us to think that samsara is pleasurable. So in Buddhism, they say, the Buddha actually talked about it, says that the 3 things that people always screw up in life is, first of all, they think everything in life is permanent. They always think that you can have this permanent self and you can achieve this permanent happiness on earth. That's wrong. The first thing to know about the world that we live in is that it is impermanent. And then the other thing to realize is that it has the nature of suffering. It's always going to change. You're never going to find any sort of complete satisfaction in it. So it's actually and so it's very important to generate these higher states of mind. Okay, and then the other thing too, which I'm not going to have time to talk about, is, there are in Buddhism 10 non-virtues, and these 10 non-virtues are not so different than the 10 commandments. They involve things like killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, harming other people through sex, lying to other people, and things like that, and also harmful speech, of various sorts, and also just malicious thoughts, wishing to harm somebody as in your thoughts. And as I said before, karma is really mainly in your minds, it's intention. Yes, we do kill somebody, but the real karma is generated by that desire, that wish to harm somebody, to actually kill them. And the physical act of killing just sort of completes that karma and makes it more powerful and to have stronger results. But the real karma is really this intention. And to help practice a virtuous life, actually in Buddhism, both in Buddhist time and current monks, there's often a lot of vows that are established. And these vows fall into different classes. There's pratimoksha vows for monks, basically things that they, promises essentially they make of how they should practice. And there's tantric vows, and there's other. But all of these vows, you should understand, are not considered to be restraints on you so much, sort of pressing down on you. They're considered to be helpful means. So by making a vow to practice certain positive things, and by trying to remember that vow, it just helps you to remember to practice these positive things and to avoid the negative things. So it's considered to be just like a helpful, it's almost like a memory device. It helps you follow the path and sort of make it more visible to you. And so it's actually it's basically, these vows are considered to be a helpful tool. They're not considered to be ways of repressing you in any way. They're sort of giving you ways of doing what you should be doing anyway, which if you really thought about how karma worked and so forth, you'd want to be doing these things. But anyway, there are many different types of vows, and one can take them, but I just don't have time to discuss them in this class, since I have to cover all of Buddhism. Okay, so the thing I want to start now is bodhicitta. So this is this Mahayana path, and again, I wish they gave me more time just to spend teaching about this, because this is very, very powerful. And again, I'm going to have to tell you what bodhicitta is and why it's so powerful. So let me just start with just the bare definition. So bodhicitta means it's an aspiration to achieve full enlightenment. So it's setting a very strong goal to achieve full enlightenment, not just liberation, but full enlightenment. And again, you'll understand as we talk more about this, you'll understand how this sort of differs. But it's this goal of achieving full enlightenment, but not for yourself, not because you want a blissful state of existence, but so that you can help as many other people as possible themselves achieve full enlightenment. So you can bring everyone else out of samsara. So if you like, you can stop. It's the goal of getting rid of all of the suffering of all other sentient beings. And again, just terminology, sentient beings means a being with a mind. And in Buddhism, animals are considered to have minds. Actually, one thing is hard, insects are considered to have minds, which I could talk a lot about. But anyway, and of course, all these hell beings and godlike beings are all seem to have minds. So that's why we just don't say humans. We say sentient beings, because any of us can, in this long samsaric cycle, can be in any of these different states. So really, it's you can think of sentient being as sort of a generalization of human being, a being with a mind. And it's the mind which, of course, does everything in Buddhism. Okay, so that's what bodhicitta is, but I have to explain more. So in a sense, when you generate this bodhicitta, and there's different levels of generating this, which I have to explain also. But when you generate full, authentic bodhicitta, it's an extraordinarily powerful mind that generates huge amounts of positive merit or good karma. And it's a transition. And so this is the goal of the Mahayana path. And this is the thing, this notion of bodhicitta, which distinguishes the Mahayana path from the lower Hinayana path or Theravadan path. The Theravadins, there were actually many other forms besides Theravadan in the early Buddhism, but the Theravadins are the only ones that have survived into the present world that still practice this sort of original Hinayana path. So in a sense, the Theravadins say, because there is a strong notion of compassion in bodhicitta, which I'm going to explain. And the Theravadins say, we have compassion also. We have deep love for all other sentient beings. We also are trying to help all other sentient beings reduce their suffering. So what's the big deal? And so I'm going to have to explain from a Mahayana point of view how they see the big deal. But I think the Theravadan point of view is useful. I mean, one should not get smug and conceited. Oh, I'm a Mahayanist, I'm better than you, that sort of thing, which has happened in the past. not to deeply spiritual people, but to beginners. Sometimes they get on their hobby horse and generate these sort of conceit, sort of arrogant types of mind. But it's not that a Mahayanist is better than a Theravadan. It's, if you like, it's sort of a deepening. The Mahayana path is, if you like, a kind of deepening, a stronger emphasis on certain aspects which are certainly there in the Theravadan tradition. I mean, certainly, as I said before, the Theravadins are right. They do have deep compassion for other beings. They do worry about the suffering of others. They do have great love for all other sentient beings. And they participate in these four immeasurables, which I talked about in the two earlier classes, about having universal love for all beings and for wishing to reduce the suffering of all beings. And the Buddha actually taught, there's actually two other aspects, which I don't have time, but the Buddha in his original teachings taught this. So in a sense, if you have total love for all beings and wish to reduce the suffering of all other sentient beings, that's sort of pretty close to the Mahayana path, but it's not exactly the same. And again, from the Mahayana point of view, they see a difference, so I need to explain that. So that's what we're going to come to. So first of all, you can ask yourself, well, why do I need to do this? Why don't I just achieve liberation from samsara? I'll have perfect happiness forevermore. Why do I need to care about bodhicitta? And there are many, again, I can't go deeply into this, but I think on the simplest level, one way that people talk about this is people talk about this in terms of people that they love in their current life. For example, perhaps this could be their parents, their mother and father. It could be their sisters and brothers. It could be their spouse or close friends. But almost all of us have people that we deeply love and care about. And if you have people that you deeply love and care about, it's intolerable that these people suffer. We hate it if we see any suffering of anyone close to us. We do everything we can to help those people who are close to us. And once you get this notion of that we're all roughly the same, and again, I'm going to talk about this in greater detail, then you can generalize that from your close friends. So what bodhicitta does is it sort of generalizes that from the people who are close to it to all sentient beings, saying it's intolerable for anyone to suffer. It's just not okay. It's not okay for anyone to experience suffering. And then you go beyond it to keep saying, I need to do something about this. And this is where we start to get to this notion of the difference between Mahayana and Theravadan notions, is that in the notion of bodhicitta and the Mahayana tradition, there is this determination. I can't sit by and let this happen. There's got to be something I can do about it. And then eventually you come to this realization that, as an ordinary person, there's not much I can do to help people. The only people who can really help large numbers of people in a very deep way are deeply spiritual people. When you look at the Dalai Lama, you see how many people he touches and how many people he can influence and help in an amazingly positive way. and you think, oh, if I had the spiritual power of a Dalai Lama, think about how much human suffering I could reduce. And then you can think, well, the Dalai Lama, there's even higher level spiritual beings. And eventually you come to the realization that only a fully enlightened Buddha has the spiritual power to actually deal. A fully enlightened Buddha is, in a sense, an infinite being, and only an infinite being can help infinite numbers of people. And so the only way, if I am determined to help all other sentient beings, the only way I can do that is for myself to achieve full enlightenment. And this type of enlightenment that you achieve is higher than mere liberation from samsara. And so why is it higher? Again, speaking from a Mahayana point of view, you can get a rough idea of why it might be higher. And that is because in the Mahayana tradition, you can actually, as you're living the spiritual life, achieve the merit that is sufficient to become liberated from samsara. But when you achieve that huge amount of merit and that spiritual purification, what you do in the Mahayana tradition is you don't stop being reborn. So as I said, in the original version of Buddha, you achieve liberation from samsara. You've eliminated the causes to be reborn in samsara. So that after that, you leave samsara and you're in nirvana. However, if you are a Mahayanist, even though you are no longer creating the causes to be reborn in samsara, you can nonetheless spiritually choose yourself to be reborn in samsara. So you're creating the causes to be reborn in samsara, not from this negativity of ignorance, but by spiritual choice. And so you continue as a Mahayanist, even though you are what's called in the language an arhat in Sanskrit, or arahant in Pali, the language of the Theravadins. So even though you've achieved this state, you choose to remain in samsara as an arhat, as an arahant, and you continue to generate more and more merit until you achieve the merit to actually do a slightly higher form of purification. Because the way they talk about this is you can think about putting garlic in a box, an analogy. If you put garlic in a box and close the lid, let it sit for a long time, you can say, well, the box is contaminated by the garlic. So you can take the lid off and you can remove the garlic. So you've removed the contamination. But then you can still, the box still will have an after smell of garlic. It's very hard to get rid of. And in the analogy of this Mahayana tradition, what you are doing is sort of, when you become liberated, you remove the gross negativity, the actual negativity, but there's a slight, very, very subtle negativity, the smell that is still there. And that's what you purify to become a fully enlightened Buddha. And that's why a fully enlightened Buddha, for example, has full omniscience, whereas a person liberated from samsara doesn't have full omniscience. And this was actually experienced while Buddha was alive. People noticed that people did become arhats while they were alive. And then when they died, they became liberated from samsara, weren't reborn again. But these arhats that while they were still living did not have omniscience, whereas Buddha did. So anyway, in the Mahayana tradition, the goal is this full enlightenment. And you can ask, and this full enlightenment requires, a full enlightenment means becoming an almost infinite being. So if you're going to become an almost infinite being, you need to achieve almost infinite good karma. So how are you going to gather all of this infinite good karma? I mean, it seems impossible, but it's not. And the way that they talk about this is, I think, quite interesting. So if you think about just being an ordinary person, maybe you see somebody in the street and they're suffering, and you help that person. If you do that, you generate some amount of positive good karma. Let's say that you see two people who are experiencing the same type of karma and you help both of them. Well, in a sense, you've generated twice as much good karma as you did with just one person. Maybe you can do this for 10 people. You generate 10 times as much good karma. So if you could imagine being able to help every sentient being, then you would generate almost infinite karma because there's almost infinite number of human beings. And that's basically how bodhicitta works. Because when you develop this mind of bodhicitta, and if it's full, complete, absolute bodhicitta, which I'm going to have to explain further because there are lesser levels, but if you have the full-blown form of bodhicitta, which is a very, very high spiritual realization or accomplishment, you have the goal where you can't help yourself. Every moment of your living life, moment by moment, your only thought is to help all other sentient beings, not one, not your favorite friends, but all sentient beings, your enemies, everyone, even people who have done horrible things. Your whole goal is to help them themselves achieve full enlightenment, which means getting rid of all of their suffering. And you have infinite compassion for these people. Compassion means the wish for them not to suffer. So every moment of your life, you are having infinite compassion, infinite love for all sentient beings. And that just generates unbelievable, huge amounts of positive karma. And it's through that mechanism that enables you yourself to achieve full enlightenment. And of course, when you can finally achieve that full enlightenment, then you can actually leave samsara and live in nirvana. But it's said that these Buddhas who are living in nirvana can, through the force of their previous promises and vows and intentions to help all sentient beings, can continue to help all sentient beings. And in fact, it's said that all of us are receiving the blessings, which means the help of all Buddhas. So you can ask yourself, well, if I'm receiving all of these blessings, why haven't I achieved full enlightenment? Why haven't they bootstrapped me into nirvana? And the reason for that is that each of us in Buddhism, each of us is responsible for our own lives. For each of us is responsible for achieving enlightenment for ourselves. And the reason for that is because it is us who generate these negative states of mind. It is our minds that generate these negative states of mind. And so it's only us that can remove these negative states of mind. And of course, the only way to permanently remove these negative states of mind is by having this wisdom insight that penetrates the ignorance which fools us into doing negative actions. And so it's only us that can actually liberate ourselves, because it's only us. We have to be the ones that change our own mind. Now, so the goal actually is to get help from the Buddhists to help us change our minds. And in the Mahayana tradition, it's said that one helpful way is to make prayers to the Buddha, which is sort of basically requests to them to help us accomplish these spiritual goals. And it's said that if we do make these requests for help, we definitely will get help. And that is one part of the spiritual path. Of course, we have to do the effort to get rid of our negative states. We have to do the effort to engage in the spiritual path, to learn about the spiritual teachings, to practice them, to meditate and so forth. But we can get help from that by making requests to the Buddhas. But the other way of looking at this, even still, you can say, well, still, why doesn't the Buddha just bless me and carry me off into nirvana? And again, it's because we have to change our minds. But the way to think about this, I think, is a very helpful analogy. It's said, again, I think it's very helpful in understanding how all of this works. What is said is, imagine living in a very sunny part of the country, which actually Santa Fe is. We have sun almost every day, single day of the year in Santa Fe. Well, I think something like 300 days a year or something, we have sun. So if you're living in a very sunny part of the world, think about living in a house. If you're living in a house, the analogy is that Buddha is the sun, and the sun is pouring down these rays of sunlight down upon the earth. And that is actually Buddha's help. That's Buddha's blessings. That's Buddha trying to help us, pouring down these rays of positivity toward us. However, the problem is that for us, it's like the analogy is we're living in a house. And for most of us, we're closing all of the doors and windows of the house and shutting ourselves in darkness, which you can think of as ignorance. So we are closing ourselves off to this help from the Buddhas. And so one way of talking about the spiritual life is opening all the doors, throwing open the shutters, letting all of the rays of Buddha's blessings flow into us and accepting those and engaging with them. Even better would be walking outside and getting the full force of all of these rays. And so in one sense, that's what these requests to the Buddha is doing. It's opening ourselves up to these blessings, to this help from the Buddha. It's not entirely clear how these blessings work. One suggestion I've heard, which sounds very reasonable to me, is that the way that these blessings work is by opening ourselves up to them. It helps us to ripen various types of positive karma, which then enables us to advance faster on the spiritual path. So it's sort of, again, like I say, who you are moment by moment does matter. If you are a positive person trying very hard to engage in the spiritual life, you are opening yourself up to these spiritual blessings, and you will tend to trigger the types of positive karma that will help you in your spiritual life. So anyway, that's just one way of looking, again, at bodhicitta. Now, there are different, it's interesting like that. Lama Yeshe, again, this person was one of the co-founders of the FBMT. He used to say that if you can really practice full bodhicitta, that, where is it? That essentially all the good things will just all sorts of good things will just pour down upon you. All sorts of good things will start to happen to you. I did mention this one case I knew of a nun who was going to various Buddhist festivals and various things, who kept getting, for no good reason, getting upgraded to business class or first class whenever she'd fly. She was flying a lot to Europe and other places. And even though she didn't have the mileage points to do so, she kept getting upgraded all the time. And that was sort of when she eventually realized that was probably just good karma. She was leading a very spiritual life, good karma was ripening. And then again, this Buddhist way of thinking, she got really upset because she was thinking, I'm wasting all of this good karma on good seats. That's really stupid. I should be using all of this positive karma on generating spiritual realizations and advancing in the spiritual path. So she then made proud prayers and requests for all of these upgrades to stop. And after that, they did. So anyway, these, when you generate this sort of bodhicitta, it generates amazing amounts of good karma. And that good karma is going to have its effect in various ways. Now, there are various levels of bodhicitta, and it's like everything else in Buddhism. Bodhicitta does not happen spontaneously. It doesn't fall out of the sky and hit you on top of your head. You have to generate the causes to create bodhicitta. And there is a path to creating bodhicitta, which I am going to talk about in a very schematic way. Again, there are full courses on this. But anyway, you have to develop bodhicitta. And in fact, all spiritual realizations in Buddhism, we use this word development. You have to develop them. You have to do the spiritual practices that create the causes for these various realizations. And in Buddhism, these things aren't just, random things. They are explicitly spelled out in the teachings. And there are whole courses on different aspects of how you achieve each of these spiritual realizations, like renunciation or bodhicitta or whatever. So there are things you can do that help you to achieve these realizations. And so you do have to develop this. And so there are different levels of bodhicitta. I mean, the main level I was talking about was full, complete bodhicitta, if you like. Or sometimes they call it real bodhicitta or spontaneous bodhicitta, because once you've achieved this realization, it just bubbles up every moment, day and night. You cannot stop thinking about it. It just spontaneously rises up with you every moment that you are around. Whereas to reach that state, you have to go through a training process. And in that training process, we head toward what we call aspiring bodhicitta, which means the wish to attain bodhicitta. Sometimes it's also called artificial bodhicitta. And actually, even this artificial bodhicitta is extremely powerful and generates huge amounts of positive karma. But it is something that you warm up to, and you begin by just learning what bodhicitta is. You learn how powerful it is, how wonderful it is, and you start learning the process by which you can sort of develop this type of bodhicitta. And along the way, you develop this real wish. You say, oh, I wish I can see how wonderful this bodhicitta is, and I really want it. I want to get it. So at that point, you're starting to develop aspiring bodhicitta. And of course, depending on how strong this wish is, you can have different levels of aspiring bodhicitta. But this is what most of us are working on. Real, actual, spontaneous bodhicitta actually usually is believed to acquire a very high meditative state called shamatha in the normal course of sequence of events. So it requires, it is a really very high realization. But we work on this artificial or aspiring bodhicitta, and we can come closer and closer to real bodhicitta. And so eventually, as we say, we can eventually achieve this. And when we eventually achieve, so again, everything in Buddhism is a gradual process. And so that's what we work on. So once we learn about bodhicitta, we work on it and we practice it stronger and stronger until eventually we're able to accomplish it. And along the way, when we're practicing these practices for bodhicitta, as I was saying earlier, we don't give up all the other practices because we need all of these renunciation, we need all sorts of other spiritual realizations, many of which I couldn't talk about. We need certainly compassion, love, all these other things to develop this full bodhicitta. And again, we have to sort of keep everything going. Okay, so now, there's another aspect of bodhicitta, which I think is extremely important, and that's this notion of self-cherishing, which is, again, some of this terminology is important because you're going to encounter it in many courses in Buddhism. And of course, this notion of wishing to reduce the suffering of all other sentient beings is sort of a type of, it's the opposite of selfishness. Most of us in our lives practice full selfishness. We're egotistically drawn. And when we're egotistically drawn, what happens is That's how we generate negative karma. It's for selfishness. I mean, our ego blows up all of these other things. We always think that there's some permanent state of ourself that will make us permanently happy. And that's what leads us to create all of the negativity that creates all of our negative karma. And in bodhicitta, it's the exact opposite of this. It's a completely unselfish point of view. And that's why it's also so powerful, is that it really helps us to prevent and block all of these negative states of mind. And so that's another aspect that makes bodhicitta so powerful. And there is this sort of irony that they talk about in Buddhism, is they talk about how the way to be happy is to is actually not to focus. Oh, okay. Yes, I've just been reminded that actually I've gone over my time. So I'm going to have to stop now because we're going to be starting another class. So I will finish up and talk more about bodhicitta next time and finish bodhicitta, and then I will talk about emptiness and also a little bit about tantric and vajrayana practice as well. Okay, thank you. So I will all see you next week.